The mystery of the unopened letter. A Miss Marple mystery. The letter arrived on a Thursday. By Friday, someone was dead. Agnes Tims noticed the first one because of the colour. Most of the post she delivered along the Davenport lane was the ordinary sort. Brown envelopes, the occasional white, a catalogue from a London department store that Mrs. Price at number 4 never seemed to order from but couldn't stop receiving. This envelope was pale blue. Not the blue of forget-me-nots or summer sky, but a particular, deliberate blue, the kind that came from a solicitor's stationery supply. Agnes knew solicitors' stationery. Her brother had been summoned to one 3 years ago over a matter involving a borrowed motorcycle and a damaged garden wall, and the letters preceding that occasion had been exactly this colour. She posted it through the brass slot at Davenport House at 8:20 on a Monday morning and thought no more about it. On Tuesday, an identical envelope arrived. Same blue, same handwriting. A woman's, she thought, though she couldn't have said precisely why. Something in the formation of the capital D. The ink was black, not the blue-black most people used, but a true, decided black. Agnes posted it. Walked on. Wednesday brought a third. She stood at the slot a moment longer than necessary, the envelope in her hand. In 4 years of delivering post along this lane, she had never seen the same letter arrive 3 days running. She pushed it through, listened to it fall, and continued on her round with the particular unease of someone who has noticed a thing they cannot yet explain. It was at Miss Marple's gate, say 20 minutes later, that she mentioned it. Miss Marple was in the garden despite the cold. October had come in sharp that year, with a wind off the fields that stripped the last of the dahlias before their time, and she was doing something careful with a trowel near the border, though Agnes couldn't have said what exactly. She looked up when Agnes unlatched the gate. 3 letters, Agnes said, handing over a single brown envelope, Miss Marple's own post, a seed catalogue. Same handwriting, same blue envelope, 3 days in a row. To the Colonel up at Davenport House. She said it the way one mentions something odd seen from a bus window. Not alarmed, just noting. Miss Marple straightened. She had a way of becoming still that Agnes had never quite been able to describe to her mother, who asked about Miss Marple sometimes. It's not frozen, just arrived at a point of attention. Identical, she said. Same everything, down to the stamp placement. And were they collected? From the box inside the door, I mean, or... Miss Marple paused, appearing to lose her thought to the dahlia bed. No, never mind. I'm sure it's nothing. Agnes was fairly sure it was something, but she had 6 more streets to cover before 9:30, so she latched the gate and went on. 3 days later, she was back. Not for the letters, or not directly. The news had come round the village in its usual fashion. Mrs. Price Ridley's cook had it from the butcher's boy, who had it from his mother, who had it from Dorothy Price, the Davenport's housekeeper, who had told no one except everyone she saw before 8 o'clock on Friday morning. Colonel Aubrey Davenport was dead. Found in his study at 7:15, slumped in the chair behind his desk, a glass of whiskey at his right hand, and no visible reason to be dead, except that he was 67 and had a heart that Dr. Haverstock had been watching with professional concern for the better part of 2 years. Agnes heard it at the post office from Mrs. Larkin, who ran the counter, and treated information as a form of currency. Natural causes, Mrs. Larkin said, with the slight disappointment of someone reporting unremarkable weather. Heart, most likely. He was a large man. Agnes thought of the blue envelopes. She mentioned them again to Miss Marple that afternoon. Properly this time, over the gate, not in passing. There was a 4th one, she said. Yesterday morning, but the handwriting was different. Miss Marple's trowel stopped. Different how? Agnes considered. She was good at handwriting, had spent her schoolgirl years filling notebooks with careful letters, had a memory for the way people formed their loops. The first 3, the capital D, had a sort of hook at the top. Definite, like the person had been taught properly. The 4th one, it was trying to look the same, but it wasn't. The hook was added on, if you follow me, like someone had copied it. Had you mentioned the letters to anyone before the 4th one arrived? Agnes hadn't. She said so. No, said Miss Marple, almost to herself. Of course not. You wouldn't have. She looked at the dahlia bed again. The wind moved through the bare stems with a sound like someone turning pages. And the letters themselves, she said. Were they When you posted them, that is. Were they ever returned? Set aside in the box. Do you know if the Colonel ever opened them? Agnes did know, as it happened. On Wednesday, the third letter, she'd gone back to Davenport House 20 minutes after her round to return an incorrectly addressed parcel she'd noticed too late. Dorothy Price had come to the door, and Agnes had seen into the hall, and the brass tray on the hall table held 2 blue envelopes, still sealed. "He didn't open them," Agnes said. Miss Marple nodded, just once, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected but needed to hear aloud. "Thank you, Agnes," she said. "That's very helpful. You have a remarkably observant eye." Agnes, who was 24 and unused to being told this by anyone, felt a warmth that lasted most of the way up Church Lane. She didn't know what she'd observed exactly, but Miss Marple did. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her window with her knitting untouched in her lap. 3 identical letters, unread. A 4th, copied by someone who had studied the original handwriting but not quite mastered it. The Colonel dead before any of them could be opened or explained, and all 3 originals gone. Dorothy had said nothing about them to the police, presumably because the police hadn't asked. Inspector Slack had taken one look at a 67-year-old man with a known heart condition and a whiskey glass, and drawn the conclusion that required the least paperwork. Miss Marple did not blame him. She thought of old Mrs. Hodgson's husband, not the current Hodgsons who kept the hardware shop, but the previous ones, the ones who'd had the drapers. Mr. Hodgson's mother had written every week for 30 years, and every week his wife Mabel had steamed open the envelope, read the letter, resealed it with fresh gum, and placed it in his hand at breakfast, unopened, to all appearances. He'd never known. But the point, Miss Marple reflected, turning this over carefully, the point was not what had been in those letters. The point was that someone had not wanted them opened, and now someone had made very sure they never would be. She picked up her knitting. The needles began to move. Outside, the last light left the garden, and the bare dahlia stems disappeared into the dark. And somewhere up the lane, Davenport House stood with its lights on, inhabited by a widow who had been, Miss Marple thought, a widow in her heart for considerably longer than one day. Careful, she said to herself. Yeah, the word that always came when she was close to something she could not yet prove. Be very careful. Miss Marple called on Cecily Davenport the following morning. She brought marmalade, the thick-cut Seville variety she made every January in quantities that exceeded any reasonable personal need, specifically because occasions like this one arose throughout the year. A pot of homemade marmalade was the perfect reason to call on anyone. It required no explanation, implied no agenda, and put the recipient in the mildly obligated position of offering tea. Dorothy Price answered the door. She was a solid woman of 55 with the slightly compressed look of someone who had been holding their breath for some time. She took the marmalade with both hands and said Mrs. Davenport was receiving visitors. Yes. Now if Miss Marple didn't mind waiting just a moment. Miss Marple didn't mind at all. She stood in the hall and looked at the brass tray on the hall table. Empty. Polished, recently. She could smell the metal polish. The kind of polishing that happens when something needs to be removed from a surface and the surface wiped clean. Dorothy returned and led her through. The drawing room was cold in the way of rooms that have had their windows opened and shut again. A peculiar thin cold with underneath it the smell of something that might have been wood smoke except that no fire was lit. There was a bowl of dried lavender on the mantelpiece, placed with precision in the centre of the great shelf, directly above the fireplace opening. Miss Marple noticed this. She also noticed that Cecily Davenport was already standing when she entered, not rising to greet her, standing. Already positioned near the window, already composed, already arranged. Her black dress was correct to the last detail, not the hasty black of a woman who'd grabbed the nearest dark thing from the wardrobe, but pressed, fitted, the black of someone who had known they would need it. Miss Marple. She crossed the room and took her hand. How very kind. Her grip was dry and firm. Her eyes were clear. I'm so terribly sorry, said Miss Marple. Such a shock. Yes, said Cecily. Do sit down. I'll have Dorothy bring tea. She said it before she sat down herself, before she returned to her chair, before the social geometry of host and guest had been established. Tea offered in the first 10 seconds, before Miss Marple had removed her coat. the gesture of someone who had been expecting a visitor and not grieving a husband. Miss Marple sat, folded her coat across her knees, and said nothing about this. The tea arrived quickly. Dorothy brought it in with the particular care of a woman carrying something fragile, set it on the low table, and left without being dismissed, which meant she'd been told to leave earlier before Miss Marple's arrival. Another small preparation. Cecily poured with a steady hand. Too steady. People in fresh grief spilled things. Their attention slipped. They poured too much or too little, or forgot the milk entirely and had to be reminded. Cecily's pour was exact. The milk went in at precisely the right moment, in precisely the right quantity. "I expect the village is full of it," Cecily said. "People are very fond of talking," Miss Marple agreed, "especially when they are sad. It's a comfort. I think sharing something, even if the something is dreadful." Cecily made a sound that might have been agreement. "Had the Colonel been unwell?" Miss Marple asked. "Dr. Haverstock, I know, had been keeping a close eye. His heart was never strong, after India." Cecily turned the teacup on its saucer once, slowly. Dr. Haverstock had warned him about the whiskey, the cigars. Aubrey was not a man who took well to being warned. "No," said Miss Marple. "Men of that type seldom are." A pause. The thin cold of the room settled around them. Miss Marple set down her cup and looked quite naturally toward the fireplace. "Oh, what a lovely piece," she said, gesturing at the lavender bowl. "Is that the Staffordshire pottery? My mother had something similar. She kept potpourri in it. The smell does linger so, doesn't it?" Cecily looked at the bowl. Something passed across her face. Too fast to name, present, and gone. "Yes," she said. "I find dried lavender keeps a room fresh. Even in October? I'm rather particular about it." Miss Marple smiled. "I wonder," she said, "whether I might look at your garden before I go. I passed the front this morning and I thought I saw foxgloves, or the remains of them at least. I've been meaning to extend my own border, and I can never quite decide on the variety." The pause before Cecily answered was 3 seconds. Miss Marple counted them. "Of course," she said. The garden was reached through the kitchen, and it was in the kitchen that Miss Marple paused to exchange a word with Dorothy, who was slicing bread with the focused energy of a woman who needed her hands busy. "Ah, dreadful thing," Miss Marple said, at her most comfortable and vague. "I always think the first days are the worst. All the comings and goings, and the house not feeling right." Dorothy's knife slowed. "Yes, ma'am." "And so much to manage. Letters to answer. People calling." Mrs. Davenport's managed it all, a slight flatness in Dorothy's voice. "Very capable." "She's fortunate to have you," Miss Marple said warmly. "Someone who knows the house, knows where everything is." Dorothy's knife stopped. "Yes," she said after a moment. "Although," she glanced at the door, "there's been things I couldn't find. Since yesterday." She said it carefully, like someone testing whether it was safe to say. "Things that were here on Thursday. That aren't now." "In the study?" Dorothy looked at her fully for the first time. She had brown eyes and the expression of someone who has been waiting to tell someone something. "Among other places," she said. Miss Marple patted her hand. "I'm sure it will all come clear," she said comfortably, and went out into the garden. The foxglove bed was against the east wall, a long row of them, dried to brown now, their tall stalks rattling faintly in the wind. Someone had been through them. Not deadheading, not the ordinary autumn tidy-up. The leaves had been stripped, carefully, selectively, from the lower stalks of perhaps a dozen plants. The work of someone who knew what they wanted and had taken only enough not to be obvious. 5 days ago, Dorothy had told her, interrupting herself, seeming to regret it, Mrs. Davenport had been out here for quite a long time. "Pressing flowers," Cecily had said, when Dorothy asked. And the stripped stalks stood in their row. The wind moved through them. Miss Marple looked at them for a long moment. Digitalis purpurea, she thought. The foxglove. Every part of it, the leaves especially, carried enough of the compound to stop a heart. A heart already struggling, already known to be unreliable. Dr. Haverstock had said the Colonel's heart was weak. Dr. Haverstock had apparently been right. She turned back toward the house. Cecily was watching from the kitchen window. Miss Marple smiled and waved pleasantly, as though she had found exactly what she came for. She had, rather. Walking home, she made a list. A bowl of lavender placed to cover the smell of burning. Letters burned. 3 of them, almost certainly, the originals. The study fireplace was the only one that had been used recently, though she had felt the particular cold ash draft when she sat near the drawing room grate. Letters that arrived daily, that the Colonel refused to open. That vanished along with him. A 4th letter, written in a copied hand, posted after the Colonel was dead, meaning someone had written it to stop the 5th or the 6th, to suggest to whoever was writing that an answer had finally come. Foxglove leaves, harvested carefully from a garden where they had no business being harvested. A widow with steady hands and tea ready before the first condolence caller had taken off her coat. And Ned Hartley. She had noticed at the funeral she must think about Ned Hartley. He had been there at the back of the church checking his watch during the second hymn. Not grief, calculation. She knew that look. She had seen it once on the face of young Martin Prescott the morning after his uncle's will was read, when the will had contained a pleasant surprise. That slight, controlled, involuntary arithmetic behind the eyes. Careful, she told herself again, turning in at her own gate. But not too careful. Not too slow. Someone had already been very careful indeed. And they were, she thought, almost certainly watching to see whether anyone had noticed. Dr. Haverstock's surgery was on Pump Lane, a narrow street that smelled of damp stone and, on Tuesdays when the bakers' ovens ran hot, of bread. The surgery itself occupied the ground floor of a Georgian terrace, the same era as Davenport House, but none of the pretension, its brass plate worn to near illegibility by 40 years of weather and the hands of nervous patients. Miss Marple arrived at 10:30 between appointments. She had telephoned ahead. She had also, with some care, described herself as calling about her own health, a slight irregularity in her pulse that she wanted Dr. Haverstock to look at. This was not entirely a fabrication. Her pulse was perfectly regular, but it was the kind of thing that required privacy, that cleared the waiting room, that meant Dorothy Price's cousin, who worked the surgery's front desk on alternate Tuesdays, would not be listening at the door. Dr. Haverstock was 63, a lean man with the permanently faintly worried expression of a doctor who had been in a village long enough to know too much about everyone in it. He checked her pulse, pronounced it regular, and looked at her with the slightly resigned air of a man who has been used as a pretext before. "You wanted to talk about Aubrey Davenport," he said. "I did, yes." Miss Marple settled her bag in her lap. "I'm sorry for the pretense, but I thought you might prefer the discretion." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a bicycle went past on the lane, its wheel catching on a loose stone. "Heart failure," he said. "There's no reason to think otherwise. I've been warning him for 2 years. The drinking alone." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but I wonder if I might ask you something rather direct, Dr. Haverstock. And I wonder if you might answer it honestly, even if the answer is uncomfortable." He looked at her. Doctors developed over years a particular wariness toward elderly women who used the word honestly in that particular tone. Oh, it meant they had already formed a conclusion and were giving you the opportunity to reach it yourself. "Go on," he said. "Did Colonel Davenport ever ask you about foxglove? About Digitalis, specifically? Its properties? Its effects? The quantities that might be significant?" The silence lasted 4 seconds. Not 3. 4. Miss Marple noted the difference. "He asked me," Dr. Haverstock said at last, "about poisons, in general. He said he was writing something, a novel, he called it, though Aubrey Davenport had never read a novel in his life, let alone written one." He turned a pen over in his fingers. "This was 3 weeks ago. I told him very little. I thought he was asking about something else." "You thought he was asking about someone else?" Miss Marple said. He looked up. "You thought," she continued, "doubt that he was asking because he suspected someone was trying to poison him, and you were worried that if you confirmed his suspicions, he would do something impetuous. Military men often do." Haverstock set the pen down. "I told him his heart was the concern, not poisons. I told him to reduce the whiskey. I thought—" He stopped. "I thought I was being sensible." "You were being sensible," Miss Marple said. "You couldn't have known. But you think someone did." Miss Marple looked at the window. A cat was walking along the outside sill with the careful indifference of cats everywhere. "I think the Colonel was afraid of something," she said, "and I think his fear was entirely justified, and I think the letters would have told him so if he had opened them. Nan, or if someone had not made very sure that he never got the chance." She did not say more than that. She thanked Dr. Haverstock for his time, paid her consultation fee over his objections, and walked home through Pump Lane and up the High Street with the careful pace of someone thinking hard and looking as though they are thinking about nothing in particular. The red herring of Dr. Haverstock had resolved itself neatly. He was not guilty of anything except a professional misjudgment, the kind that haunted good doctors, the decision that seemed reasonable at the time and catastrophic in retrospect. She felt for him, but he was not her concern. Ned Hartley was. She had sent him a note that morning. She did this sometimes, issued invitations in the language of lonely old age, slightly plaintive, slightly apologetic. "I wonder if you might spare a few minutes for an old woman who knew your uncle slightly, and who finds these days after a bereavement rather at a loss for company." Men like Ned Hartley, charming, financially uneasy, accustomed to managing elderly relatives, responded to this kind of note automatically. It required so little of them, and they were practiced at performing sympathy. He arrived at 3 o'clock with a bunch of chrysanthemums bought from the garage at the end of the village, the price sticker not quite fully removed from the cellophane. "Miss Marple." He filled the doorframe briefly. He was tall, with the remains of good looks and the addition of something slightly slack about the jaw. "Terribly kind of you to think of me." She took the chrysanthemums with every sign of pleasure and put them in a vase while he settled himself in the armchair by the fire. The tea arrived. Miss Marple poured. She gave Ned Hartley 2 biscuits on his saucer without being asked, and he ate both before she had lifted her cup. "Such a shock," she said. "Your uncle, though of course we all knew about his heart." "Exactly." Ned wrapped both hands around his cup. "Poor old Aubrey. Heart was always going to get him in the end." Miss Marple looked at him pleasantly. He had said it very naturally. Too naturally. The phrase polished smooth with repetition, ready for this conversation, or the next, rounded off at the edges. Heart was always going to get him in the end. Now the sentence of someone who had been rehearsing the appropriate response since before the appropriate response became necessary. And it was 5 words too definite. The cause of death had not yet been confirmed by the coroner. Dr. Haverstock's certificate said cardiac arrest, yes, but the coroner's office had not yet closed the matter. Ned Hartley should have said probably the heart, or they think it was the heart. He should have added the small grammatical uncertainties that genuine mourners added, because genuine mourners had not decided yet what to believe. He had decided some time ago. "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "He seemed well when I last saw him, but then one never can tell, can one?" She watched his hands as she said this. His right hand. The ink stain. Faint, at the base of the index finger, and the kind left by a fountain pen held for a long time. Not today's stain. Yesterday's. Or the day before. The 4th envelope, she thought. Copied handwriting. Someone who had studied the original and practiced. "I imagine," she said, passing the biscuit plate, "that there will be a great deal to sort out. The estate, and so forth." "Cecily's managing it all," Ned said, a shade too quickly. "Of course, she's a very capable woman." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Though I suppose there are legal complications, always with these things. Wills? Entailments? Your uncle was a man with property. Nothing too complicated." He reached for a 3rd biscuit. "Cecily gets the house." Miss Marple said nothing. She let the silence sit between them like a 3rd person. Ned looked up. "Under the will, that is. She's provided for." "Of course," Miss Marple said warmly. "How right that she should be, after everything." He smiled. It was a good smile, practiced like the sentence about the heart, maintained like a garden one had stopped loving but couldn't afford to let go to ruin. She smiled back. After he left, Miss Marple stood at the window and watched him go down the front path. He walked quickly, with relief. The walk of a man who had been tested and believed he had passed. He hadn't. The ink stain, the rehearsed certainty about the heart, the fraction too fast correction about Cecily and the will, and something else, something she had caught at the very end when she saw him to the door. On the outer edge of his right shoe, a fleck of something pale, ash, the grey-white ash of burned paper. Very fine. Not today's ash. Ground in. He had been in that study. Not to discover the body. Before. She stood at the window until his car disappeared around the bend in the lane. Then she went to her writing desk, drew out 2 sheets of her good notepaper, uncapped her pen, and wrote a letter. The letter was addressed to a Miss E. Partridge, care of a solicitor's firm in London, a firm whose name she had obtained without any great difficulty from Agnes Tims. Agnes, it turned out, had not only noticed the handwriting on the envelopes, but had noticed the return address printed on the reverse flap of the first 3. She had not mentioned this initially because nobody had asked. Nobody asked Agnes very much, as a general rule. Miss Marple wrote carefully. She described herself as a family friend of the late Colonel Davenport, recently widowed, concerned about certain matters relating to his estate. She mentioned in passing that she understood some correspondence had been sent to the Colonel recently, of a legal nature, and that the Colonel had unfortunately died before the matter could be addressed. She expressed with some delicacy the concern that the matter might now go unresolved, and said she would be very grateful for any clarification Miss Partridge could offer. She sealed the envelope. She addressed it in her usual hand, nothing copied, nothing studied, the looping, slightly arthritic script of a woman of 72 who had learned copperplate in a different century. Then she went to make supper. There was nothing to do now but wait for the reply, and while she waited, she could think. She had, she believed, the shape of it. What she needed now was the substance. The reply from Miss Partridge came on a Wednesday. It was a single sheet, typed. Miss Partridge was clearly a woman who kept her professional habits, even in correspondence that strayed outside them, and it confirmed, in the careful language of someone who had thought hard about what they were and were not permitted to say, everything Miss Marple had suspected. She read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases, placed it in the top drawer of her writing desk, and sat for a long time in the chair by the window with her knitting in her lap and her eyes on the garden. The dahlias needed cutting back properly. She had been meaning to do it for a week. She did not do it now. The problem, she thought, the real problem underneath the murder and the letters and the careful practiced widow, was not complicated. And it only appeared complicated because several people had worked very hard to make it appear so. At its centre was a simple fact. Colonel Aubrey Davenport had married his first wife, Margaret, in 1923. He had gone abroad, India, then Africa, then various postings that blurred into one long imperial distance, and the marriage had quietly ceased to function, in the way that marriages sometimes did when one person went away and neither person found the paperwork of ending things worth the effort. Margaret had moved to Bournemouth. Aubrey had moved on. In 1947, back in England, he had married Cecily Holloway, without at any point having divorced Margaret. Miss Partridge, secretary to a Mr. Aldous Webb, solicitor of Gray's Inn, had discovered this irregularity while preparing papers related to a separate matter entirely. A property question. The kind of routine work that sometimes turned up the non-routine. She had written to the Colonel, promptly and correctly, to advise him of the situation and its legal implications. The Colonel had not opened her letters, but someone else had opened the first one, before Agnes's 3-day sequence, weeks before. The letter Miss Partridge had sent in September, the original, had been intercepted, read, and destroyed. And then Miss Partridge, receiving no response, had begun again, trying once more to reach a man who was, she had no way of knowing, being carefully kept from receiving her. Cecily had read that first letter, had understood immediately what it meant, had understood that her marriage was void, that the house was not legally hers, that 20 years of careful, managed life in that cold Georgian manner were built on a foundation that had never been solid, and had, with the particular cold intelligence of someone who sees a problem and addresses it directly, removed the problem. Not the letters. You could not stop a solicitor writing letters forever. But the Colonel himself. The heart that Dr. Haverstock had obligingly documented as unreliable. The foxgloves in the garden that she had planted herself years ago and tended with a possessiveness Dorothy had noticed but not understood. Digitalis extracted carefully from the leaves, introduced into the whiskey, the nightly whiskey that the Colonel poured himself from the decanter on the study sideboard that no one else in the house touched, and that he drank alone before bed, with the regularity of a man who had drunk alone before bed for 30 years. Then the letters burned. The fourth letter, written in Cecily's careful, copied hand, written to Miss Partridge to suggest that someone had finally responded, that the matter was being dealt with, buying time and silence. And Ned. Miss Marple's needles began to move. Ned Hartley had not planned the murder. She was fairly certain of that. He was not, at his core, a planner. He was the kind of man who recognized an opportunity and stepped into it, which was a different thing. Cecily had told him. Perhaps in a moment of fear, perhaps in a moment of calculation. Perhaps both. She had needed someone to know, or had let it slip, or had trusted him because his interests aligned with hers. And under the Colonel's original will, the one made in 1948, before any subsequent amendments, the estate passed to Ned in the event that Cecily predeceased or was found legally unable to inherit. If the second marriage was void, Cecily had no legal standing. And Cecily, who had read enough law in that September letter to understand the shape of her position, had proposed an arrangement. She would act. He would wait. Afterwards, he would inherit, and he would share. The fourth letter, Ned's contribution, she thought. Cecily could plan a murder. Ned could copy a handwriting convincingly enough to buy a few weeks. Each had done what they were suited to. The ash on his shoe. He had been in the study, helping burn the evidence, being useful in the small ways that implicated him just enough to make silence in his interest. She thought of Mrs. and Bantry's gardener, old Thomas, who had burned 3 months of receipts in the incinerator the very morning the taxman was expected. She had asked him once, mildly, why he had not simply burned them the day before. He had looked at her with the expression of a man who has not considered that his logic is visible. People who burn things in a hurry, she thought, are never burning things they wished they'd kept. The study fireplace, the lavender bowl, the ash that had not quite finished being ash before she arrived with her marmalade. Cecily had been careful, but not quite careful enough. The careful ones rarely were. There was something else. She set the knitting in her lap and looked at the ceiling. Cecily had burned the letters, had removed the evidence of why anyone might have wanted the Colonel dead, and had manufactured the cause of death, a heart attack, with convincing precision. Had been ready when the condolence calls began, had managed every detail of grief with the efficiency of a woman who had been rehearsing. But she had replaced the lavender bowl too precisely. That was the thing that bothered Miss Marple in the way a slightly crooked picture bothered her, not urgently, just persistently, a small wrongness that the eye kept returning to. The bowl was centered on the great shelf with the accuracy of someone who had measured. Natural housekeeping placed things approximately. Guilt placed things exactly. It was, she thought, the same impulse that had driven Cecily to offer tea before sitting down. The compulsive neatness of a person managing their own fear. So every detail controlled because one uncontrolled detail might be the one that mattered. It was, in its way, almost a kind of confession. She thought about Margaret Davenport. Miss Partridge's letter had included, in its careful and controlled way, enough to locate her. A Bournemouth address held by the solicitor's office for correspondence purposes. A woman of 71, apparently in reasonable health, who had, according to Miss Partridge's one moment of departure from professional language, been most distressed to learn of the Colonel's death and most anxious that the legal matter be resolved without causing unnecessary pain to anyone. Most anxious to cause no unnecessary pain. 71 years old, living quietly in Bournemouth for 30 years. Who had never wanted anything from the Colonel, apparently, except to have the legal situation resolved while she was still alive to see it done. And instead, she was the reason he was dead. Not her fault. Not remotely her fault. But Miss Marple felt the weight of it nonetheless. The long reach of an old man's laziness, his failure to manage 40 years ago the simple paperwork of ending a marriage, trailing forward through time until it arrived here. A Georgian manor in October, a glass of poisoned whiskey, a bowl of lavender placed too precisely over a cold grate, Margaret Davenport in Bournemouth, not knowing any of this, just waiting for a reply that would not come from a man who was no longer alive to send it. Waiting, Miss Marple thought. That word again. So many people in this story had been waiting. Agnes for 3 mornings, wondering about the blue envelopes. Dorothy for months, and watching a household that frightened her, and not knowing why. The Colonel, not opening letters he perhaps suspected would tell him something he did not want to know. And Cecily. Waiting since September, since the moment she read that first letter and understood. for the right moment to stop waiting forever. Miss Marple put down her knitting. She went to the telephone. Inspector Slack was not pleased to hear from her. He was, she could tell from the particular quality of his silences, in the middle of something he considered more pressing, which was to say, virtually anything. He said the Davenport matter was closed pending the coroner's certificate. He said Dr. Haverstock had been very clear about the cause of death. He said, with the careful politeness of a man suppressing considerable irritation, that he was quite sure Miss Marple's concerns were— "There is ash in the study fireplace at Davenport House," Miss Marple said when he paused for breath, "that I believe a laboratory would find consistent with the paper used by the solicitors' firm of Webb and Partners of Gray's Inn. Specifically, a particular blue-tinted bond stationery. I also believe that an analysis of the whiskey decanter, if it has not already been cleaned, which I suspect it may have been, might reveal traces of Digitalis. And I have a letter which arrived this morning from a Miss E. Partridge of that firm, which explains very clearly why Colonel Davenport received 3 identical letters in the week before his death, and why someone in that house needed very badly for him never to read them." A longer silence. Miss Marple. "I would also," she continued, "pleasantly speak to Mr. Edward Hartley about the ink stain on his right index finger and about the ash I observed on his right shoe when he called on me on Monday, and I would do so fairly promptly before he has the opportunity to speak at length with Mrs. Davenport and agree on what they are both going to say." The silence this time had a different quality. "I'll come round," Slack said. "I'll put the kettle on," said Miss Marple. Inspector Slack arrived at 4 o'clock with a younger constable whose name Miss Marple did not catch, and an expression suggesting he had spent the drive from the station rehearsing reasons why this would turn out to be nothing. Miss Marple gave him the letter. He read it standing up, which meant he had not intended to stay long. By the time he finished, he was sitting down, and the constable was writing in his notebook with the focused energy of someone glad to have something concrete to do. She told him everything, not in the order she had assembled it. That would have taken longer and required him to follow threads he would have kept trying to cut short. She told it in the order that would convince him, which was a different architecture entirely. The lavender bowl first, then the foxgloves, then Agnes and the handwriting, then Ned's shoe, Ned's ink stain, Ned's sentence about the heart, delivered with the smoothness of a line learned by repetition. Then the letter from Miss Partridge, which explained the why of all the rest. Slack listened without interrupting, which was unusual. When she finished, he sat for a moment with his hands on his knees. "The decanter," he said. "I would move quickly. Cecily Davenport is not a careless woman. She has had several days to consider whether anything remains to be managed." He stood. "I'll need you to make a formal statement." "Of course." "And the letter, I'll need to take it." "I made a copy," said Miss Marple, "before I telephoned." Slack looked at her. He had, over the years, developed an expression specifically for use with Miss Marple. Not quite exasperation, not quite respect, occupying the complicated territory between them. He used it now. "Right," he said. "We'll go up to Davenport House." She did not go with them. She had not been asked, and she did not invite herself. That was not her role. Her role had ended at the telephone, and she knew it, and she was, sitting now by the window, with the early dark coming down over the garden, not entirely sorry that it had. And she heard later from Dorothy Price, who came round the following morning in a state of controlled agitation that expressed itself as an excessive interest in whether Miss Marple needed any shopping done, what had happened. Slack had gone to Davenport House. He had spoken to Cecily. Cecily had been apparently very still, very careful. For perhaps 10 minutes she had answered every question with the precision of someone walking a narrow path in the dark, placing each foot exactly. Then Slack had mentioned Miss Partridge's letter. The stillness had broken all at once. Not dramatically, Dorothy said, not in the way of actresses in films, not with tears or raised voices. More like a held breath finally and completely released. Cecily had sat down in the chair by the study window and looked at her hands and said in quite an ordinary voice, and that she supposed there was no use in any of it now. Ned, reached by telephone at his flat in London, had required approximately 4 minutes of questioning before deciding that his interests lay in a direction other than loyalty to Cecily. He confirmed the arrangement. He confirmed his knowledge of the bigamy. He confirmed, with the practised ease of a man converting rapidly from accomplice to witness, everything that needed confirming. His fingerprints, when the partially burned envelope was retrieved from the study grate, were on the outer edge of the surviving fragment. The ash from the rest tested, as Miss Marple had suggested it would, consistent with Webb and Partners' blue-tinted bond. The decanter had been washed. But the glass, the whiskey glass, left beside the Colonel's body, taken by the constable who'd attended the scene as a routine matter of record, had not been washed. It was still in the evidence store. The laboratory found what the laboratory found. 3 weeks after Cecily Davenport was charged, Miss Marple wrote a second letter. This one went to Bournemouth. It was not a long letter. It explained, as gently as clarity permitted, what had happened. It confirmed that the legal matter Miss Partridge had raised was now being addressed through the proper channels, and that Margaret's position, her actual legal position, was understood and would be respected. It said that the estate, once the matter was resolved, would most likely pass to a charitable trust the Colonel had established for retired soldiers, which had been his intention before events had overtaken the question of intention entirely. It said near the end that none of this had been Margaret's doing, and that no one with any sense would think otherwise. It was signed, simply, Jane Marple, St. Mary, Mead. A reply came 10 days later. 2 sentences. "Thank you for writing. I just wanted it settled before I went." Miss Marple read it twice. Then she placed it in the drawer with Miss Partridge's letter and did not take it out again. Agnes Tims came by on a Friday morning 3 weeks into November with the post. A seed catalogue, a letter from Miss Marple's nephew Raymond, a circular from the village hall about the Christmas fete. Agnes handed them over at the garden gate. The dahlias had been properly cut back now, finally, belatedly, last week, and the border looked stripped and correct and ready for winter. "Did you hear?" Agnes said, and with the careful neutrality of someone who knew she was close to the centre of something and wasn't sure of the etiquette. "About Mrs. Davenport?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I did." "And it was the letters," Agnes said, "right from the start. All from those letters." She said it not as a question but as someone setting a thing down, placing it in the right position so it could be examined properly. "It was the unopened letters," Miss Marple said. "That's rather the distinction, I think." Agnes considered this. Her grey eyes. She had grey eyes, Miss Marple noticed, and thought she had thought them brown when they first spoke at this gate, which was the kind of small error one made and rarely caught, moved to the stripped dahlia border and back. "If he'd just opened them," Agnes said. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "If he had." She took her post. She looked at it without seeing it for a moment, thinking of a woman in Bournemouth who had spent 30 years waiting for a thing to be settled, and of a man who had spent 30 years not settling it, and of the long, patient distance between those two facts. "People are so afraid," she said, "of what letters might contain. They tell themselves they'll open them tomorrow. And tomorrow. And then one day they don't have a tomorrow, and someone else decides for them what the letter meant." Agnes stood at the gate a moment longer. "Is that from somewhere?" she asked. "Something you read?" "No," said Miss Marple. "I don't think so. I think I just know it." She went inside. The gate latched behind her. The November wind moved through the stripped dahlia bed with a sound like turning pages, and the garden settled into its quiet, and the lane was empty, and that was the end of it. The end.